Hello, and welcome to Element I Emergency Preparedness in the Small Employer webinar series. Once again, we have Lauren here to help facilitate the Emergency Preparedness section of the webinar series. Take it away, Lauren.
Thanks a lot, William. This is the last session for our webinar series today, so let's get started with emergency preparedness. So our course objectives for today are familiarization with the requirements for the emergency preparedness, understand the emergency management and responsibilities for employers, managers, and workers, understand the hazards and risks with each emergency situation, and identify and understand the OC audit requirements. The 5 lessons that we've broken this down into today are regulatory requirements, emergency management, types of hazards, OC requirements, and finally an action plan, so that when we have any issues in the other elements of your program, we can have an action plan to correct those deficiencies. So let's get started with lesson 1, regulatory requirements. There's 4 main requirements under the regulations. They are the emergency requirements, emergency procedures, training, and notification. The first one we really need you to be aware of is the risk assessment portion. Each employer must conduct a risk assessment in any workplace in which a need to rescue or evacuate workers may arise. And the translation for this is basically every work site that's out there. Everyone is going to have some need to evacuate the building, whether it's for potential gas leaks or a possible fire. So everyone needs to have a rescue plan or an emergency response plan for those situations. The second part of this, however, is if the risk assessment required by subsection 1 shows a need for evacuation or rescue, appropriate written procedures must be developed and implemented, and a worker assigned to coordinate their implementation. This section refers to things like hot work, working at heights or confined spaces, where, for instance, a worker might require special rescue to get him down off of that 50-foot platform or out of that boiler or whatever that he's working in. So be aware that if you're in those situations, not only do you need an assessment, but also procedures on rescue. Now, this hazard assessment doesn't have to be difficult. And here's an example that we've had from our previous hazard ID training that we've talked about. And basically what we do with this is make sure that we've identified the possible issues for emergency at your facilities, things like fire and explosions, medical emergency for health, or medical emergency for trauma. And the reason that I've separated those is everyone has a possibility of a health concern in their workplace, whether it's from a heart attack or diabetic coma. But then depending on the risk of your other operations, you might not have the trauma-related hazards. For instance, the likelihood in an office facility versus a machine shop are substantially different for trauma. In addition, you also should take a look at whether you have issues around power failure or gas leaks, bomb threats, or robbery. Now, obviously, if you're not a bank, you don't need to worry about the robbery. But again, do you have gas leaks that are potential issues in your facility? So depending on your facility, you're going to have different issues. Once you identify the hazard, then you can come up with the controls to mitigate that hazard. Next, we have written rescue evacuation procedures. So again, these are required for working at high angles or at height, working confined spaces, working in hazardous substances, underground work, work over water, workplaces where there's persons who require physical assistance to be moved. And some of our work sites have people that have disabilities. Remember that in an emergency situation, you're not allowed to use the elevator. How are you going to get that person in a wheelchair down the stairs? Now, this is quite possible, but you need to have a plan to effect in case of that situation. Now, also under Emergency Procedures 4.14, emergency means of escape must be provided from any work area in which malfunctioning of equipment or a work process could create immediate danger to workers, and regular means of exit could become dangerous or unusable. This happens quite a bit for operating booths and control rooms. If there's a problem is there a secondary way to get out of that particular enclosure? Remember that emergency exit routes must be designed and marked to provide quick and unimpeded exit. As a side note, make sure that in your workplace inspections that you check your exit routes to make sure that they're maintained in a clear manner and that the exit lights are functioning. Each year, emergency drills must be held to ensure awareness and effectiveness of emergency exit routes, procedures, and a record of the drills must be kept. Whenever we have procedures, we need to have training, and workers must be given adequate instruction in the fire prevention and emergency evacuation procedures applicable to their workplace. Workers assigned to firefighting duties in their workplace must be given adequate training by a qualified instructor in fire suppression methods, fire prevention, emergency procedures, organization and chain of command, firefighting crew safety, and communications applicable to their workplace. That was a mouthful. However, if you have an office-type atmosphere where you have very little risk of fire, you can delegate the firefighting duty to the fire department. You just need to clearly communicate to your employees that they are not to try to fight a fire. And as a result, their responsibility is simply to evacuate the building. The disadvantage of this strategy is that it could be very intense as far as property loss in the event of a small fire. Retraining for firefighting duties must be provided periodically, but not less than once a year. So remember, if you're signing up for firefighting training, that it has to be repeated on a regular basis. If you have a worker that's assigned to firefighting duties, he must be physically capable of performing the assigned duties safely and effectively before permitting to do them. Again, this is similar to the responsibility to ensure that you are not going to provide a respirator for someone that has a breathing difficulty. You do not assign firefighting duties to someone with a heart issue. Otherwise, you're going to be looking for trouble. One other requirement under the regulations is the notification of fire departments. With a lot of businesses, they take on different duties over the period of their work, and as a result, they change their hazards. If an employer having a workplace controlled product covered by WHMIS, whether it's chemicals, explosives, pesticides, radioactive material, consumer products, or hazardous wastes, in quantities which may endanger firefighters, they must ensure the local fire department is notified of the nature and the location of the hazardous materials or substances and methods to be used in their safe handling. This is usually in your fire safety plan that your fire department has a copy of. However, saying that, a lot of fire safety plans are not updated regularly, and as a result of changes in business, new products are brought forward without notifying the fire department. So be aware to check your fire plan to make sure it's consistent with the materials you have on site. So just a brief review. All companies are required to assess possible emergencies that could take place at their work site and develop procedures to allow people to safely leave the site. It's also a requirement to keep your exit routes clear and train employees in responsibilities under the plan, including drills. And don't forget to allow for disabled persons on your site. So our first polling question for today. Does everyone understand the legal requirements for emergency response? I'll give you a minute to respond. Great. Everyone's got a handle on this. Next, we're up with Lesson 2, Emergency Management. There's several aspects of emergency management we're going to cover today. Excuse me. First, the 4 phases of emergency management: program overview, the vulnerability assessment, ER plan elements, some training and resources, and testing your procedures. The 4 phases of emergency management are, first, mitigation. One of the key parts about identifying your hazards that affect your company is the mitigation. And these are the efforts to reduce hazards or the impacts of those hazards. And that's why we have firefighting programs or fire extinguishers, sprinkler systems, etc. Those are trying to reduce the hazard of fire, for instance. Next, we need to know about the preparedness for those hazards. Do we have fire training? Do we have proper equipment to fight a fire? Are our employees aware of the signs of fire so that they can prevent it from happening? Next is the response. What actions are we going to take in an emergency? For instance, with an earthquake or a power outage. How are we going to communicate those to our employees? And how are we going to maintain track of our employees so that we can locate them when we need them? And lastly is recovery. It's important for us to understand that if we have a hazard, how are we going to minimize its impact on our business? If we have freezers that are full of product, are we going to have an emergency response of having a generator or an emergency generator available to keep the freezers operating while the power is out? These are simple things to do, but as a result of that, you can save your company thousands of dollars in expense. In order to have an effective program, you need to have a written emergency response plan. You want to have a designated emergency coordinator. And I know the answer that a few of you are going to ask is like, I only have 15 employees. Why do I need to have a designated emergency coordinator? And the reason that you need to have someone designated is so that he can control the key areas of the plan, whether it's taking the role or whether it's making sure that certain things are covered as far as power outages or shutting off the gas. He doesn't necessarily have to do that, but he has to coordinate it to make sure it is done. By having it clearly designated will prevent someone from saying, I thought someone else was doing it. You need to have regular emergency drills. And a lot of us are good about having evacuation drills or fire drills. But most of us are not so good on having emergency rescue drills for confined space or for high angle rescue. So again, it's one of those things that if you don't practice it, do you have the right equipment? Does it work effectively? Are your people properly trained? When was the last time that they actually practiced what they were trained? So again, this is an opportunity to make sure that your emergency planning processes are working properly. Every time we do a drill, we want to make sure we do an evaluation to see how we can improve it or what items didn't work well. We want to make sure that we check on the communication procedures. Were they adequate? Emergency contacts. Who was actually trained and how can we contact them? We want to make sure there's sufficient resources to maintain the emergency response plan as far as maintaining the equipment, maintaining the training for our employees. We also want to make sure the evacuation procedures are clear and that they're effective. And this sounds pretty simple, get everyone out of the building, but do we marshal them beside the propane tank? Adequate first aid facilities and triage areas. If we do have a serious fire at your facility, where can you take people that are injured? Is there a safe place to put people down where they're not going to be exposed to things like fire in the building or possible chemicals or spills or gases from the building? You want to make sure that there's an adequate provision and maintenance of adequate resources, tools, equipment, and training for your emergency programs. And this could be something as simple as having required food supply if you're in an out-of-the-way situation for multiple days in case of an earthquake. First on this list is a vulnerability assessment. How likely is the situation to occur? If your company is located beside the dike on the Fraser River, what are the chances of you having a flood? So we need to take a look at that probability and say, is it something that we need to be concerned about? If you have a company that deals with a lot of flammable chemicals, what are the chances of you having a fire? How often does it occur? How often is it possible for one to get away on you? What means are available to stop or prevent the situation? Can we take those chemicals or flammables away and put them in a different building? That's a possibility, but it still might not stop the event from happening. What is necessary for a given situation? Do we need to have firefighting material? Do we need to have rescue baskets to pull someone off of a high-angle situation? Do we need to have tripods for confined space rescue? If the power goes off, what is the potential impact to the workplace? Is it going to cause you to lose thousands of dollars of product in the freezer? Is it going to affect the environment or the community if you have an ammonia leak? Next, we move on to the emergency response plan elements. We want to make sure that there's a section on communication procedures. How are you going to keep track of your employees and your communication structure so that the required elements take place? Who is the emergency contact numbers that you are going to call if you have a gas leak or an ammonia leak or an injury to a particular person? List of emergency response personnel. Who is trained to fight fire or deal with a leak? The proper evacuation procedures. If you have a chemical plant, where are you going to evacuate to? Where is that going to be relative to the wind? Formal update process. Remember that the only thing that's constant in business is change. And as a result, your people are going to change, your processes are going to change, and even your chemicals you use in your processes could change. So remember to have a regular review and update of your plans to make sure they're still effective. Anytime we have procedures, we need to make sure that they're properly communicated and trained to both the managers, supervisors, and workers. Everyone has a responsibility. This doesn't have to be complicated. It can be as simple as remembering to close the fire door on your way out of the room, or shutting off the power to your machine. It's key that everyone understands their proper role in the emergency, depending on what type of emergency you're having. Remember to keep them aware of the components of your emergency response plan, who will be in charge during an emergency, and make sure that any training that you do must be documented and records must be retained. One of the biggest problems we have with most of our clients is their failure to maintain their documentation. Now, some resources for emergency planning that you might not have thought about are exit signage for your plant, firefighting equipment, first aid personnel, first aid facilities and equipment. This can be things like rescue baskets and rope for rescue, just additionally. Emergency eye wash facilities. And remember that this is directly tied to the potential of what type of chemicals you carry on site. If you have chemicals that are very caustic, some of them need to be washed or rinsed for up to 45 minutes continuously. That means that you have a special requirement to have a tankless water heater to ensure the water temperature doesn't get too cold during that 45 minutes. That's a very expensive option compared to possibly using a less toxic or caustic chemical. So be aware of that. Rescue equipment for confined space entry, including SCBA or self-contained breathing apparatus. For most small employers, this is not a requirement because they don't have these applications, but be aware that if that's part of your plan, that there's a maintenance procedure for all equipment. And SCBA has higher requirements than a lot of safety items. Remember, if you're doing confined spaces, that you also need to have gas detection systems and portable meters that are going to require service and maintenance and calibration for all confined space entries. And also, what type of communication devices are you going to use? This can be as simple as portable air horns, or it can be walkie-talkie type systems for your entries. Next up is testing the procedures. Having an emergency procedure is good, but if you haven't tested it, you don't know that it's going to work. Remember that they need to be tested on a frequency based from the risk assessment. How often is this possible to happen, or what is the likelihood, will give you an idea of how often you need to check to make sure it works. Saying that, I don't believe you should have any emergency response procedures that you haven't tested at least once. So remember to start getting that going. Any tests that you do, make sure that they're properly documented, and then review and evaluate your test outcomes for possible retraining or revision of your procedures and possibly the equipment that you're using to do that rescue or that procedure. Now, the next one here is just a sample review form, and this is available on our Learning Center webinar page, so you don't have to write up a new one, but it just goes through a few of the very basic questions, like, was the evacuation signal clearly heard by all your employees? Did all the employees evacuate? If not, why not? Were all the employees properly accounted for? Were there any issues with the procedure? How long did it take to get everyone out of your facility and be accounted for? Remember that just a few minutes of not knowing where people are can make a big difference in the health of that person if they're still inside the building. If the fire department shows up, they're going to need to know immediately, is there anyone left in the building? And being confused about this will just delay the rescue of that person that's left inside. Lastly, don't forget to check to see if your visitors and contractors were properly accounted for. Again, you're responsible for everyone on your site. So just a little review for emergency management. Ensure that you've evaluated the possible emergency situations that are present at your work site. If you have identified possible emergency situations that require rescue, ensure you have the tools and training to effect rescue. So our next polling question, does everyone understand the requirements for setting up an emergency response program? So I'll give you a minute to respond. Great, everyone's got a handle on that. Let's move on to lesson 3, the types of hazards. And these break down into 2 groups, usually the technological hazards and then the natural hazards. So let's get started with the technological hazards. These are the ones that we usually think about. These are the ones like fire and explosion, building collapse, a major structure failure, spills of flammable liquids, or an accidental release of toxic substances. We also have unintended releases of hazardous biological agents, exposure to ionization radiation, loss of electrical power, loss of water supply, loss of communications, and lastly, sabotage. This is not one that's frequent, but with the terrorist activities that are out there, it should possibly be on some people's list depending on the business that you work in. Natural hazards. These are the ones that are on the news as far as floods, earthquakes, tornadoes, severe windstorms, ice storms, or severe extremes in temperature. We also have pandemic diseases like influenza or bird flu, or the one that was in Toronto a couple of years back, SARS. Possibly remember that we also have the possibility of one event triggering others, and it can cause issues with your system. For instance, if we have an earthquake, we can rupture a gas line, which causes a fire. The problem with that is the fire department can't get to the fire because the road is damaged, and your water supply is also broken. So that's just one example of how multiple things can happen as a result of one event. Remember that explosions may start, or actually this is a little bit upside down. If you have a fire, you can also have an explosion as a result that can cause structural failure. And an earthquake might initiate all events above, with addition to the chemical and physical hazards in your plant. So that sounds like a mouthful, but understand there's additional resources. For all of you that have smartphones, which I think is most of you, there is an emergency response guideline available online for your iPhones and smartphones that will identify the products that are covered under the TDG. It'll also put them into one of 65 groups for emergency response procedures, and you can be used by employers for a basic response to material spills and leaks. And again, this is on our website under the Element I section of the webinar page on the Learning Center. And you can flip through this on your iPhone and have all that material available on a leak or on an app. This book is also available if you want to purchase the book. But again, if you want to take a look at it first, there's the app. So a quick review of the hazard types. Be aware of the hazards that are present at your workplace, including both the technological and the natural hazards. Whichever ones you identify, develop a plan to deal with the hazards that will likely affect you. Next polling question. Does everyone understand the situations they need to plan for? This one's a little bit tougher, but I'll still give you a minute to respond. Good. Everyone's got a handle on this. Again, at the end of the session, if you have any specific questions, maybe make a note of those. Next, we're on to lesson 4, our OC requirements. In order to receive your certification, you're going to have an ER plan, some training, emergency drills, your responsibilities clearly documented, and the resources in place to fulfill the plan. Going through the steps for an emergency response plan, you're going to need to have a plan that includes communication procedures, emergency phone numbers, a list of emergency response personnel that are available or trained, the evacuation procedures for your specific facility, and a regular review process to ensure that it's current. You're also going to need to have a record of training for managers, supervisors, or workers in their designated, and the emergency designated coordinator as well, trained in their emergency preparedness procedures appropriate to their responsibilities. And that's a very key statement. Obviously, everyone doesn't need coordinator training, but the workers on the floor need to know what their responsibilities are, and the managers need to know who is going to be taking the role to take care of their employees. Next, we have the emergency drills. Emergency preparedness procedures are tested at the requirement frequency specified by the risk assessment. So again, most of these annual frequency is sufficient. If you have a high-risk area, then you should be doing it at a higher frequency. For today's exercise, annually will probably be a start. Remember that your emergency response personnel are retrained when required, which means for firefighting, for instance, at least annually. And remember to do your emergency preparedness tests and make sure that they're reviewed and evaluated to identify any deficiencies that you find or areas for improvement. The first time that you do a drill, you'll be surprised at how many things didn't work the way that you had planned. For the OC requirements, it's also key that you have your responsibilities clearly labeled so everyone knows what their responsibilities are under the emergency response plans. And lastly, the provision of the proper resources for the maintenance of the program, including the emergency preparedness resources such as firefighting equipment, rescue gear, training on rescue procedures, gas detecting equipment, etc. So just a quick review of this. We need to make sure we build an assessment for the possible emergencies that you could face at your company. We need to have a plan for dealing with the hazards. We need to communicate and train the managers and employees in the use of the plan. We need to provide the required resources for rescue if you have things like confined space, high angle, or working at heights. We need to test the plan with a drill to ensure that it was effective. And again, this is key because most of the things that you're planning are not going to work that way when you try them the first time. Remember to regularly evaluate the plans for possible changes. Next section, Lesson 5, Action Plans. So all of you have received the binder that we sent out at the beginning of the program, and we have a list at the back of things to check your elements with. With this section here, all you have to do is identify the gaps in your programs and fill them. There's a sample action plan. We have this on the Learning Center so that you can fill this in. This is a requirement under the Small Business Employer Auditing Program to have one of these filled out. So again, you want to make sure that you have all the requirements nailed down. This is again on the Learning Center for you to take a look at and download. So just a little bit of a review of what we've covered today. We've talked about the regulatory requirements, emergency management, types of hazards, the OC requirements to get through this section, and an action plan. Any questions?
Yes, Lauren, I do have a couple questions from today's session. Question number 1. Am I required to have more than one marshalling point for emergency response at my facility?
Well, this is actually a good question, because if you have chemicals on your site that could leak, such as ammonia, for instance, you're going to have to make sure that you have multiple marshalling points in effect that would be affected by the wind. And you're also going to have direction finders, such as a windsock, so that you know which way the wind is blowing. If you're having an emergency situation with ammonia, you want to make sure your people are not going to be marshalling in a point that would be in the route of that leaking ammonia. So in that case, you might have 2.
Makes complete sense to me. The second question that I have, can you use the fire department for a firefighting response, or must I train staff internally?
Well, this is another good point, because for a lot of businesses, they don't have a big fire hazard, and training their people to fight the fire is going to be a more costly than having the fire department come in the situation of a fire. So you can use that as a response, but you must instruct your employees not to fight a fire when they're not trained, and just evacuate the building.
Okay, 2 more questions. Question 3. Do I need to develop a hazard response plan for workplaces that share a building with me?
The answer for this is yes, you do. If you have a chemical plant next door, you should have a plan to deal with the possibility of them having a leak. Also, a communication strategy with them so they can communicate when they have an issue that you need to be aware of. You also might have some response plan requirements, such as a respirator, to protect your employees while they leave the site.
Sounds good. And finally, the last question that I have for today. The action plan, does it speak about things that I have already done or outline what my intentions are to complete?
The action plan is designed to make sure that before you submit your material for your auditing process, that you've crossed all your T's and dotted your I's. So you can ask the questions at the back of the binder on your existing elements and ensure that you've completed all the sections before you submit it for certification.
Sounds good. That's all the questions that I had for today. If anyone does have any additional questions about the webinar series, please feel free to ask them at any time or email.
So I'd just like to congratulate everyone with sticking through us through this process. This has been the first one that we've done, so thank you for that. You have completed the small webinar series from my point of view. You are also eligible for the Small Employer Program Building e-learning course that's available on our Learning Center for free. Normally this is a $100 course, but because you've signed up with this program, we'd like to give this to you free. So please take advantage of it. And lastly, we will be sending out an email survey to check on any feedback or any suggestions that you might have on this series for the next group of people that will be going through this process. So I'd like to thank you for participating and have a great day.